The city was alive with activity as the golden hues of sunset cast their warm glow over the bustling streets. Among the gleaming facades of high-end establishments stood Maison Étoilée, a renowned French-inspired restaurant known for its refined cuisine and luxurious atmosphere. People came here not just to eat but to experience exclusivity, a place where only the right kind of customers were welcomed with open arms. At the heart of this establishment was Émilie Cartier, the restaurant's manager. Émilie was a sharp-dressed woman in her early 30s, with her blonde hair styled impeccably into a neat bun. She was poised, confident, and, most notably, ruthless in upholding the restaurant's standards. To Émilie, the restaurant wasn't just a place of business. It was a fortress of prestige that required guarding. In her eyes, anyone who didn't fit her idea of sophistication simply didn't belong. Table 4 is asking for an extra bottle of Chateau Margaux. A young waiter informed Émilie nervously as she reviewed the seating chart for the evening. Émilie didn't even glance up. Then bring it. And make sure they know it's our last bottle. Scarcity makes it taste better, she said curtly before dismissing him with a wave of her hand. She prided herself on every detail, from the marble tabletops to the crystal chandeliers. But what Émilie valued above all else was exclusivity, keeping undesirables out. That evening, as the dinner rush was in full swing, a quiet disturbance occurred at the entrance. Standing just outside the double-glass doors was an elderly black man dressed in a neatly pressed, albeit modest, gray suit. His shoes were scuffed but polished. His hat slightly tilted to one side as he clutched it in his weathered hands. The host, a young man named Liam, hesitated. He had been trained by Émilie herself to recognize potential issues. Yet something about the man's gentle demeanor made him pause. Before Liam could make a decision, Émilie appeared. "Liam, what's the holdup?" Emily's voice sliced through the air as she strode toward the entrance. This gentleman was hoping to be seated," Liam stammered. Emily's sharp eyes scanned the man from head to toe. He didn't fit. His attire, his age, his very presence, everything about him clashed with the pristine, carefully curated image of Maison Étoilée. The faintest curl of disgust flickered on her lips. "I'm sorry, sir," Emily said, her tone clipped and devoid of warmth. "We're fully booked tonight." The man glanced past her, noticing several empty tables near the windows. "I don't mind waiting," he said calmly. His voice was deep, weathered with age but steady. Emily's patience thinned. "As I said, we are fully booked," she repeated. "Perhaps you'd find something more suitable at the cafe down the street." The man's expression didn't falter, though his eyes revealed a quiet disappointment. "I've heard wonderful things about your restaurant. I'm certain it's worth the wait." Emily leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but not her condescension. "This is not a diner, sir. We have a certain standard to maintain, and frankly, I'm not sure you'd find our menu or atmosphere suitable." The older man stood still for a moment, processing her words. Then, with a small nod, he turned to leave, but as he did, he glanced back at her, his piercing gaze meeting hers. For the briefest second, Emily felt an unsettling shift in the air, but she dismissed it as the man exited the restaurant. Barely minutes after the man left, Emily noticed him standing near the street, still within view of the restaurant. He seemed to be lingering, gazing at the brightly lit windows and the diners inside. Irritated, Emily gestured for Liam to call security. "I don't want him loitering around here," she hissed. "This is not a public park." Liam hesitated again but complied, dialing the restaurant's private security service. Moments later, a burly guard appeared. Without hesitation, he walked out to the street, where the old man still stood, hat in hand. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said firmly. "You're going to have to move along." The man didn't argue. He simply nodded again, replaced his hat on his head, and began walking down the street at a slow, deliberate pace. From inside the restaurant, Emily watched the interaction unfold. Satisfied, She turned her attention back to her duties, dismissing the encounter entirely. But not everyone inside had ignored the scene. A young couple dining near the window had witnessed everything, their conversation growing hushed as they exchanged uneasy glances. Across the room, an older gentleman shook his head in disapproval. Whispers began to ripple through the restaurant, though no one dared confront Emily directly. The following week, Maison Étoilée was buzzing with anticipation. The owner, Jonathan Carter, had returned from a business trip overseas and announced a meeting with all senior staff. Jonathan was a well-respected businessman in his late 50s, known for his sharp instincts and commanding presence. Though he was seldom at the restaurant in person, his vision and leadership were evident in every detail of its success. Emily was eager to impress him. She prepared a detailed report highlighting the restaurant's financial performance, her own contributions, and plans for future expansion. What she didn't include, of course, was any mention of the incident with the older man. As the staff gathered in the private dining room, Jonathan entered, his broad shoulders and confident stride commanding immediate attention. He exchanged polite greetings before addressing the room. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "This restaurant's success is a testament to your hard work, but today, I want to discuss something personal." The room fell silent. Jonathan's tone had shifted, becoming more solemn. "Many of you know that my father and I have been estranged for years," he continued. "But recently, I've learned that he's been trying to reconnect. In fact, he mentioned visiting the restaurant last week." Emily's chest tightened. She forced herself to maintain composure, though her mind raced. Could it be the same man? Jonathan's gaze swept the room. "If any of you saw him or spoke to him, I want to know. He's an older man, in his 70s, and he may not have introduced himself. But he's my father, and I want to make things right." The weight of Jonathan's words settled heavily on Emily's shoulders. She remained silent, her expression carefully neutral, but deep inside, a sense of dread began to take root. The clinking of glasses and the quiet hum of conversation filled the luxurious dining room of the restaurant. A sense of routine calmness cloaked the establishment as Emily prepared her reports for Jonathan, the owner, who had just returned from an extended business trip. She smoothed out her neatly pressed blazer and carried a leather folder containing financial summaries, operational updates, and marketing plans. If there was one thing Emily excelled at, it was presenting a spotless front. Jonathan walked into the office, a tall man with streaks of silver in his hair and an air of command. He was known for his approachable demeanor, though today, his brow was furrowed. Emily noted his distracted expression but chose not to comment. "Emily," Jonathan greeted, taking a seat behind his polished oak desk. "How has the restaurant been running while I was away?" Emily began her presentation, smoothly outlining recent successes, the increase in clientele, and glowing reviews. She avoided mentioning the incident with the elderly man, as it seemed inconsequential to her. Just another disruption handled effectively. Jonathan nodded, impressed, but then, he paused. "I noticed something odd when I reviewed the security footage from the past week. A man, elderly, seemed to have been turned away from the restaurant. Care to explain what happened?" Emily's heart skipped a beat, but her face betrayed no emotion. "Oh, him? Just someone who wandered in looking out of place," she replied smoothly. "I thought it best to handle the situation to maintain the restaurant's image." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Out of place? Emily, we pride ourselves on welcoming everyone who respects our space. I hope there wasn't any misunderstanding." "It was nothing serious," Emily insisted, brushing it off. "Besides, we need to maintain a certain standard, don't we?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, a shadow of unease crossing his face. But before he could press further, his phone buzzed. "We'll revisit this later," he said, dismissing her with a nod. As Emily exited the office, her relief was short-lived. In the hallway, a younger server who had witnessed the incident glanced at her, their expression unreadable. Emily's confidence faltered. Something about the way they looked at her made her skin crawl. That evening, Jonathan stayed late at the restaurant, sitting in the now empty dining room. A single candle flickered on his table as he nursed a glass of wine. His thoughts drifted to his father. It had been years since he'd last seen the old man. Their last encounter was an argument. Heated words exchanged over differing views of success and family. His father had been a man of simple principles, believing in fairness, kindness, and humility. Jonathan, on the other hand, had been ambitious, determined to climb the ladder of wealth and prestige. When Jonathan opened the restaurant, he had hoped to bridge their differences, but his father, always stubborn, refused to visit, claiming he had no place in such a pretentious establishment. It stung, but Jonathan had learned to push the hurt aside, convincing himself that his father's pride was to blame. But now, something gnawed at him. The man in the security footage, though older and more worn, bore an uncanny resemblance to his father. Could it be him? Had his father finally decided to visit, only to be turned away? Jonathan's chest tightened. He resolved to find out. 2 days later, the restaurant was abuzz with activity. Jonathan had announced a special family dinner to the staff, an event meant to reconnect with his relatives and, perhaps, his father. Emily had been tasked with overseeing the preparations. Though she worked with her usual efficiency, her mind was preoccupied. The shadow of her earlier actions loomed larger with each passing moment. As the evening approached, the restaurant gleamed under warm lights. Guests began to arrive, relatives, close friends, and a few prominent figures in Jonathan's circle. Emily stood near the entrance, greeting them with a rehearsed smile. Then, amidst the well-dressed crowd, a figure appeared. It was the old man. Emily froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched him enter. His steps steady despite his age. He wore the same worn coat, his posture upright, and his eyes sharp. It was as if he carried an invisible strength that dared anyone to confront him. Jonathan saw him too. The glass in his hand nearly slipped as he stood, his expression a mix of shock and recognition. "Dad?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the old man. The old man's gaze swept across the room until it landed on Jonathan. His lips curved into a faint smile. "Hello, son," he said, his voice deep and steady. Jonathan approached him, his hands trembling. "It's been so long," he murmured. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" "I wanted to," the old man replied, glancing briefly at Emily. "But I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome." The words hung heavy in the air. Jonathan's brow furrowed as he turned to Emily, whose face was pale. The truth was beginning to unravel, but Jonathan hadn't yet pieced it together. "Come, sit," Jonathan said, ushering his father to a seat at the head of the table. The other guests murmured quietly, their curiosity piqued. As the dinner began, the atmosphere was a blend of joy and unease. Jonathan tried to catch up with his father, asking about his life and where he had been all these years. The old man answered with brief, measured responses, his eyes often drifting to Emily. Finally, the old man set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "Jonathan, I have something to tell you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I visited this restaurant a few days ago." Jonathan stilled. "You did? Why didn't you tell me?" The old man's eyes never left Emily as he continued. "I was turned away by someone who didn't think I belonged here." The room went silent. Jonathan's face darkened as he processed the words. He turned to Emily, who looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Emily," Jonathan said, his tone dangerously quiet. "Is this true?" Emily stammered, her usual confidence shattered. I didn't know. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize what?" Jonathan demanded, his voice rising. "That he's a human being? That he's my father?" Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but the old man raised a hand, silencing the room. "Jonathan," he said softly, Let her speak. Emily's voice quivered as she tried to explain, but her words only deepened the weight of her actions. She admitted to profiling the old man, assuming he didn't fit the restaurant's image. Her excuses sounded hollow even to herself. Jonathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "We'll discuss this later," he said curtly, turning to his father. He added, "Dad, I'm so sorry. You deserve better than this." The old man placed a hand on Jonathan's arm. "Apologies won't change the past, son, but perhaps we can change the future." The room was silent as the old man's words hung in the air. Emily felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her, and for the first time, she realized the full extent of the harm she had caused. The evening's uncomfortable silence lingered long after Jonathan's father, Henry, finished speaking. Guests whispered among themselves, the weight of the revelation permeating the air. Emily, seated near the far end of the table, felt as if every eye in the room was focused on her. Jonathan sat motionless, his hand clenched tightly around the stem of his wine glass. The fury in his expression was barely contained as he turned toward Emily. "I need an explanation," he said coldly, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. Emily's hands trembled as she rose from her seat, her words fumbling as she began. I didn't know who he was," she stammered. He looked out of place. "I thought." "You thought what?" Jonathan interrupted sharply. "That you had the right to judge someone by their appearance? That my father, my family, didn't deserve basic respect." The intensity of Jonathan's voice caused Emily to flinch. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "It wasn't personal," she whispered. "I was trying to protect the restaurant's image. I didn't mean to." "Protect it from what?" Jonathan shot back. "From someone who didn't fit your narrow view of who belongs here? That's not protection, Emily. That's discrimination." Henry, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. His voice was calm but carried the weight of experience. "Jonathan, let her speak. I'd like to hear her reasoning. Maybe we can learn something from it." Emily's eyes darted toward Henry, and for a brief moment, she saw no anger in his gaze, only disappointment. The room seemed to hold its breath as she began to explain. "I thought I was doing what was best for the restaurant," she said, her voice cracking. "We cater to a certain clientele, and I thought keeping up appearances was important. I never meant to offend anyone." "Keeping up appearances," Henry repeated softly, as though testing the phrase. "And what do those appearances cost? Emily? Respect? Dignity? Humanity?" Emily had no answer. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet Henry's eyes. Jonathan dismissed the guests shortly after the confrontation. The family dinner that was meant to be a joyous reunion had turned into an evening of tension and regret. Henry stayed behind, seated at the head of the table as Jonathan paced the room. "I can't believe this happened," Jonathan said, his voice raw with emotion. "How could she think this was acceptable?" Henry watched his son silently for a moment before speaking. "Jonathan, mistakes like this don't happen in isolation. They're the result of the culture we create. You need to ask yourself why someone in your organization thought this was the right decision." Jonathan froze, turning to his father. "You're saying this is my fault?" "I'm saying it's your responsibility," Henry replied evenly. "As the leader, you set the tone. You decide what's acceptable and what's not. Maybe Emily acted on her own bias, but the environment allowed it to happen." Jonathan sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "So what do I do? Fire her? Issue a public apology? None of it feels like enough. You start by making it clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated," Henry said firmly. "And then you rebuild. One policy, one conversation, one action at a time." Jonathan nodded slowly, his father's words settling heavily on his shoulders. "You're right. I have to fix this." The next morning, Jonathan called an emergency staff meeting. The employees gathered in the dining room, murmurs of confusion filling the air. Emily stood at the back, her face pale and drawn. Jonathan stood at the center, his voice steady but stern. I've called you all here because something unacceptable happened in this restaurant. A failure of our values. My father, Henry, was treated with disrespect when he came here. And while that incident is inexcusable, it's a symptom of a larger problem. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I want every one of you to know that this restaurant will not tolerate discrimination, prejudice, or any behavior that undermines our commitment to respect and inclusivity. Today, we start making things right. The room was silent as Jonathan outlined a plan to conduct a thorough investigation. He invited staff members to come forward with any information about incidents they had witnessed or experienced. A third-party consultant would be brought in to review the restaurant's policies and recommend changes. As the meeting adjourned, a few employees approached Jonathan privately, sharing their accounts of the environment under Emily's management. Their stories painted a troubling picture of a workplace where appearances were prioritized over kindness, and where certain guests were subtly discouraged from returning. Emily's dismissal was inevitable. Jonathan called her into his office later that day, his expression unreadable as he handed her a formal termination letter. Emily, he began, I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm doing it because I have a responsibility to this restaurant, to my family, and to every person who walks through our doors. Your actions were unacceptable, and they've damaged the trust this place is built on. Emily accepted the letter with trembling hands. I never meant for it to go this far, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was doing what was right. You thought wrong, Jonathan said bluntly. I hope this serves as a lesson, for you and for everyone who works here. Our actions have consequences, and it's time we start holding ourselves accountable. As Emily left the office, she felt the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her. Her career, her reputation, and her sense of self had all been shaken. But beneath the humiliation, there was a flicker of something else, the realization that she needed to change. Meanwhile, Jonathan and Henry sat together in the dining room, discussing the path forward. Henry suggested implementing training programs to educate the staff about unconscious bias and the importance of empathy. Jonathan agreed, determined to transform the restaurant into a place where everyone felt welcome. That night, as the restaurant closed and the last of the staff departed, Jonathan and Henry shared a quiet moment. I'm proud of you, Henry said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. This is just the beginning, but you're taking the right steps. Jonathan smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing. Thanks, Dad, for everything. As they left the restaurant, the lights dimmed behind them, a symbol of the new chapter they were about to write. The weeks following Emily's dismissal marked a turning point for the restaurant. Jonathan's first step was to convene a team meeting, outlining the changes he intended to implement. He stood at the head of the dining room, flanked by his father, Henry, whose presence added a quiet but powerful authority to the proceedings. We're not just changing policies, Jonathan began, his voice steady but resolute. We're changing the culture of this restaurant. This place was built on hard work, respect, and inclusivity. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of those values. It's my responsibility as your leader to bring us back. The staff listened intently as Jonathan detailed a new training initiative focusing on empathy, diversity, and unconscious bias. A third-party consultant, experienced in workplace equity, would conduct workshops and regular evaluations. Henry spoke next, his deep, steady voice commanding the room. I've lived long enough to see the damage caused by ignorance and prejudice, he said. But I've also seen what can happen when people choose to do better. This is your opportunity, not just to save this restaurant's reputation, but to grow as individuals. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. For many employees, this was a wake-up call. They realized that the changes weren't just about policies. They were about creating a place where everyone felt valued. As the days turned into weeks, Henry became a more prominent figure at the restaurant. Though he declined Jonathan's offer to formally join the management team, he agreed to act as an advisor, visiting regularly to share his wisdom and observe the changes taking place. Henry's presence was transformative. He spent hours talking to the staff, learning their stories, and offering quiet advice for the younger servers, many of whom had never interacted closely with someone like Henry. These conversations were eye-opening. His stories of perseverance and his unwavering belief in treating people with dignity resonated deeply. One evening, Henry noticed a young dishwasher, Mia, struggling with a stack of plates in the kitchen. He approached her with a warm smile and began helping her load them into the machine. "You don't have to do that," Mia said, startled. "You're a guest here." Henry chuckled. "No one's above lending a hand," he replied. "Tell me, Mia, what's your dream?" Mia hesitated, her cheeks flushing. I want to open my own bakery someday," she admitted, "but it feels impossible. I barely make enough to get by." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "Dreams are only impossible if you stop chasing them," he said. "Keep working hard, and when the time is right, take the leap. You'd be surprised what you're capable of." Mia's eyes glistened with tears as she thanked him. Moments like this became commonplace during Henry's visits, his quiet encouragement sparking newfound confidence in the staff. Meanwhile, Emily struggled to rebuild her life. Her dismissal from the restaurant had left her humiliated, but it also forced her to confront the biases and arrogance that had driven her actions. For the first time, she saw herself through the eyes of others, and she didn't like what she saw. Determined to change, Emily began attending workshops and seminars on diversity and inclusion. She read extensively, diving into stories of people who had faced discrimination and adversity. The more she learned, the more she realized the depth of her ignorance. One day, while volunteering at a community center, Emily met an elderly woman named Margaret, who ran a mentorship program for young people from underprivileged backgrounds. Intrigued, Emily struck up a conversation. "Why do you do this?" Emily asked, watching Margaret patiently guide a teenager through a college application. Margaret smiled. "Because everyone deserves a chance," she said simply. "And because I've been on the other side, wondering if I'd ever get one." Her words struck a chord with Emily, who began volunteering regularly. Through her work at the center, Emily not only found purpose but also began to heal. She wrote a letter to Jonathan and Henry, apologizing for her actions and expressing her gratitude for the lessons she had learned. Months later, on a crisp autumn evening, Emily found herself standing outside the restaurant. The glowing lights and the lively chatter of diners filled the air. But Emily hesitated. She clutched a small gift, a book on the history of community dining spaces, and a handwritten note. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The staff greeted her with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Jonathan, who was in the middle of inspecting a new menu item, looked up and froze when he saw her. "Emily," he said, his tone neutral. "What brings you here?" Emily swallowed her nerves and approached him. "I came to apologize," she said. "Not just to you, but to everyone here, and to your father." Jonathan studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he nodded. "He's in the dining room. You can talk to him." Emily found Henry sitting at his usual table, sipping a cup of tea. When he saw her, he raised an eyebrow but didn't seem surprised. "Mr. Henry," she began, her voice trembling, "I don't even know where to start, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am for the way I treated you. It was wrong, and I've spent every day since trying to understand and grow from it." Henry set down his cup and regarded her thoughtfully. "And what have you learned?" he asked. Emily hesitated, then said, "I've learned that respect isn't something we give based on appearances or assumptions. It's something we owe to everyone, simply because they're human." A slow smile spread across Henry's face. "Good," he said. That's a start. They talked for a while, Emily sharing her journey of self-discovery and Henry offering words of encouragement. When she left, she felt lighter, as though a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally been lifted. Jonathan watched the interaction from afar, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He couldn't deny that Emily's transformation was genuine. Perhaps, he thought, redemption was possible for everyone, if they were willing to work for it. With Emily's apology marking a turning point, Jonathan and Henry felt a renewed sense of purpose for the restaurant. Over the next few months, they worked tirelessly to implement the changes they had promised. Staff training sessions became regular events, focusing on empathy, diversity, and the art of true hospitality. Henry, though hesitant at first, became a central figure in these sessions. His life experiences and ability to connect with people made him a natural teacher. One of the most impactful sessions was titled Every Guest, Every Story, where Henry shared his personal encounters with discrimination and how small acts of kindness had often changed his perspective. During one such session, Henry shared a story about his younger days as a traveling salesman. "I remember a time," he began, "when I walked into a diner after driving all night. I was exhausted, hungry, and just wanted a cup of coffee. The man behind the counter looked me up and down and said, 'We don't serve your kind here.'" The room fell silent as Henry continued. "That man's words stayed with me for years, not because of the insult, but because of what he denied me, simple humanity. That's what we're fighting to preserve here, making sure no one walks out of this restaurant feeling less than human." The staff responded with newfound enthusiasm. For many, these sessions were eye-opening, challenging them to confront their own biases and commit to being better. As the restaurant thrived under its new direction, Emily found herself yearning for a way to contribute. Though she had moved on professionally, working at a nonprofit organization focused on equitable employment practices, she still felt a connection to the place where her journey of self-reflection had begun. One day, she wrote to Jonathan. In her email, she expressed her admiration for the changes he and Henry had made and offered to share insights from her new role. "I know I don't deserve a second chance," she wrote, "but if there's any way I can help, even from the sidelines, I would be honored." Jonathan was initially hesitant. While he appreciated Emily's growth, he worried about the staff's reaction if she returned in any capacity. He discussed the matter with Henry, who listened thoughtfully before offering his opinion. "Second chances aren't just for the people who ask for them," Henry said. "They're for the people who give them. If you believe she's sincere, maybe it's time to see what she can offer." After much deliberation, Jonathan invited Emily to join as a consultant for the restaurant's community outreach initiatives. Her first task was to develop partnerships with local organizations to make the restaurant more accessible to underserved populations. Emily threw herself into the work, determined to prove that she could contribute positively. As time passed, the restaurant became a beacon of inclusivity in the community. It hosted events like Community Night, where meals were offered at discounted rates, and proceeds supported local charities. Henry spearheaded a mentorship program for young professionals, helping them navigate the challenges of the hospitality industry. The restaurant's transformation also brought the family closer. Jonathan and Henry spent more time together, working not just as business partners but as father and son. Their once fractured relationship began to heal, with mutual respect replacing old grievances. One evening, as the restaurant celebrated the launch of its new initiative, Henry stood before the staff and guests to give a toast. "This place has always been more than a restaurant," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "It's a reflection of who we are, our values, our struggles, and our hopes. Tonight, I want to thank every single one of you for helping us turn those hopes into reality." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jonathan felt a swell of pride. For the first time in years, he felt like he was living up to the example his father had set. Months later, on a quiet evening, Henry and Jonathan sat together in the now familiar dining room. The restaurant was closed for the night. The chairs stacked and the lights dimmed. They shared a bottle of wine, their conversation drifting between business and family. "I never thought we'd get here," Jonathan admitted, swirling his glass. "When you walked through those doors that night, I thought I'd lost you forever." Henry smiled, his eyes warm. "You didn't lose me. You just needed to find yourself first." Jonathan nodded, the truth of his father's words settling in. "And Emily? Do you think we made the right choice, giving her a second chance?" "She's done good work," Henry said, "and she's learned what so many people never do, that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a better future." As they talked, a young server entered the room, nervously holding a notebook. "Mr. Jonathan? Mr. Henry? I was hoping to ask for some advice," she said. Henry waved her over, motioning for her to sit. "Of course," he said. "What's on your mind?" The server hesitated before asking, "How do you stay so patient with people, even when they're difficult?" Henry chuckled. "Patience, my dear, is like any skill. You practice it until it becomes second nature. And you remind yourself that everyone is carrying something you can't see. A little kindness goes a long way." The server nodded thoughtfully, jotting down his words in her notebook. As she left, Henry turned to Jonathan with a grin. "Looks like you're stuck with me as the unofficial wisdom guru of this place." Jonathan laughed. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The two men sat in companionable silence, the weight of their shared journey lightened by the knowledge that they had created something truly meaningful. The restaurant, once just a business, had become a symbol of hope, redemption, and the enduring power of human connection.